Good afternoon and welcome to Critical Limit. My name is Michael Sun, and before we begin, I want to pay my deepest respects to the lands on which we're gathered today, the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung lands of the Kulin Nation. Sovereignty was never ceded. This event is presented by Liminal in partnership with the Wheeler Centre, and the Liminal Festival as a whole is supported by the Victorian Government through Creative Victoria. Thank you again for showing up. We're going to have an hour of power, as they say. We're going to be chatting all things criticism. And I guess to start off, I might ask both Cher and Eda to introduce themselves.
Oh, okay. Just going down line. Okay. You're very decisive. Hi, everyone. And thanks for the introduction, Michael. I'm Eda Gunaydin. I am born and raised in Western Sydney and very happy to be here this weekend for such a kind of exciting, vibrant new venture. I was just given a tote bag backstage, and it's truly gorgeous and representative of the festival as a whole. But enough about the tote bag. Yes. I am a writer of creative nonfiction as well as a critic. By day, I'm a lecturer at the University of Wollongong. And in 2022, I published my first book, a collection of essays called Root and Branch. For anyone with kind of eagle eyes, you can see that I'm wearing them on my ears. And that same book is, I think, back there as well. And in terms of my kind of critical career, I was a contributing editor between 2022 and 2023 at the Sydney Review of Books, and have also published criticism myself.
Hey, I'm Cher Tan, and I'm a writer of creative nonfiction too, essays, critic. I'm an editor at Liminal, and also the reviews editor at Me Engine. That's all I'll say to introduce myself. Let's just go into the discussion.
And Cher also has a book that you can buy at the bookstore over there called Peripathetic.
Yeah, that came out in May, 2 months ago.
You look very nonplussed by your book.
No, I'm not nonplussed. I just forgot to mention it.
Well, you just got the back of like your launch events, and that's really,
I think I've been talking about it too much.
It's really draining.
It's sort of like
and
at the back of my head now.
What we were just talking about this last night, one gets sick of hearing their own voice, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why you have asked to keep talking about your book for you.
Yeah.
I'm Michael Sun, by the way. I'm also a writer and critic, and I work in culture and lifestyle at The Guardian. And I do not have a book because I don't have the attention span for that. But yeah, let's begin by talking about how we really got into criticism. Because I think this is a question that, that we often get asked, and especially on panels like this, but I'm curious to ask it anyway, and I'm curious to hear your stories, because I don't think I've heard both your stories.
Are we just going to have me be the one who goes first?
No,
I mean, we can change it up.
I can start now.
Okay,
to make it a bit more egalitarian, let's just say. I got into criticism pretty unconventionally, you'd say. I wrote in zines and blogs and message boards when I was quite young. I grew up in Singapore, which is, I would say, an authoritarian country, and there wasn't many outlets to critique anything really, and I felt a lot of displeasure at the system around me when I was quite young, and I grew up and came of age in punk and metal subcultures, and that exposed me to different modes of thinking, and as a result I started writing for myself, in blogs, message boards, zines, as I was saying, and that became my point of entry into critical writing, which I discovered I really enjoyed, and then kept writing on the internet, you know, spitting words into the vortex, and here I am, I suppose.
Was that writing about the internet at that time, or was it about punk and music and?
There was a little bit of punk and music, and but also about the status quo around me, which I was quite angry about, but couldn't really speak to on a more public level, and therefore I was writing in these little, you know, these little missives, like just around, and to show my displeasure at things.
I too, I suppose, come to criticism via displeasure. Primarily, yeah, look, I think my pathway to criticism really came through being an aspiring memoirist. I mean, originally I was an aspiring writer of fiction, and it turned out no one was particularly interested in me doing that. So I graciously accepted that, and yeah, I just kind of had a bit of luck publishing a memoir, which happened to kind of adopt a more, I suppose, an essay form, and some of my most early publishing was in the Sydney Review of Books, which I'm sure you all know is a platform publishers review essays. And at the same time that I was starting to publish work like that, around the kind of 2019 point, I was also just starting a PhD in politics, political theory, and finding I was doing a lot of reading of a lot of theory and generating my own thoughts about that. And yeah, the reason I asked you if some of your earlier work on the internet and on blogs was about the internet is because I think like our common theorists, or I think that our most common theorists are people who are kind of in that early wave of theorizing about the internet and platforms like Mark Fisher and Jodie Dean. So yeah, I was just kind of curious to know if that was where you were coming from, because that is where I was coming from, as I'm sure a lot of kind of leftists all have their entree into theory via their kind of theorist darlings that they think about. I mean, I literally have a cross stitch of Jodie Dean's face that I have hung up on my wall in my office. Yeah, and then, I'm so sorry, I just want to say one more thing, which is not about my biography. But it's interesting you kind of raised the point that maybe some part of you, possibly due to the repressive context that you were in, was kind of feeling resistance and wanting to vent and push back a little bit because, well, this reminds me of a very brief anecdote, I swear to God, of having been in the Blue Mountains in Sydney last week with some writer friends. We were in a mini writing retreat, and one of my friends, a gorgeous poet, was talking about the fact that she gets really bad insomnia and stays up late, as some of us are sometimes prone to do, reading Wikipedia. So she was regaling us over breakfast this morning about the fact that she'd read the entire Wikipedia entry for capital punishment. And so we were talking more broadly
I'm quite familiar with that.
about how repressive, about how repressive, and her girlfriend is Singaporean. So they were kind of saying like, yeah, you know, Singapore is extremely restrictive context, and then the Singaporean person in the room was sharing about the fact that when one wishes to protest in Singapore, although there is not a very robust culture of protest, you have to register your protest ahead of time, and then there's like an allotted moment where you can raise your signs. And I started to feel like, oh, that doesn't seem so strange and unfamiliar to me, actually, as we see protest law get reformed more and more in this country. And more informally on university campuses, as we know, student activists are being subjected to surveillance, as well as restrictions like this about when and how and where they can do protest. And I was just thinking that perhaps another word for protest to me would be criticism. So I want to throw that on the table to talk about more in a second, but of course I want to hear about your trajectory.
Well, first of all, I want to talk about reading Wikipedia pages.
Okay, yes.
Because, no, I really appreciate that story because I feel like I'm also someone who is like serial insomniac and serially reads Wikipedia pages. This morning I read the entire Wikipedia page for bull, like a male cow.
Thank you. Yeah.
And it was deeply edifying. Can I just say, like, it's like
What didn't you know that you now know?
I didn't realize that there were so many different agricultural practices they use to keep the bull calm in the pen, including some practices which honestly, well, like many agricultural practices, seemed quite cruel. Like they like string the bull's legs. Because anyway, like this is my 5 a.m. thoughts coming to the floor to haunt me forever. But I would recommend that page, bull.
Bull, got it.
Yeah.
I'll write it down.
Yeah.
B-U-L-L,
Or bull brackets like disambiguation. Okay. I guess my trajectory, it's kind of almost like the opposite of what we were talking about earlier, like coming from a place of displeasure. I think I almost came to criticism from a place of pleasure and then perhaps like an overly permissive culture, by which I mean I was like the gayest 14-year-old of all time, and I had like a deep crush on Ryan Gosling, and then the editor of my high school magazine, which was in its nascent years and desperate to attract people, was like, please, does anyone want to write something? And I was like, I would love to write film criticism about Ryan Gosling. And then I got my own film review page, in which I mostly just talked about Ryan Gosling. And honestly, like from that moment onwards, I was like, I want to write words on the internet from now on. So yes, I think that was honestly my trajectory into how I got into criticism. And then, of course, later on, the displeasure came as well, which I think does really lead us onto the next thing I want to talk about, which is, we were talking about this earlier as well, really briefly, but what is the kind of dominant emotion that drives our criticism, whether it be like pleasure or displeasure? Like, what kind of frame of mind are you in when you feel really spurred to critique something?
This is a question that I was only thinking about last night. I'm so sorry to tell a series of kind of inane anecdotes. This will be my last one. But last night, someone you may have heard from earlier in the day, James, Jiang, and I were walking back to our hotel room, and I was recounting some therapy session I'd been in recently, in which my therapist, I promise it will end soon, in which my therapist kind of asked me to visualize my inner child being in the room, and she said to me, what emotion do you feel towards her? Is it sadness? And I said, no, it's contempt. And James said something along the lines of also kind of having his own healthy feelings of contempt. And I kind of speculated out loud about whether or not contempt is one of those feelings that drives one to embrace criticism. Just a thought bubble. So I think that as much as I'm joking about contempt being one of those things that drives me, I think there's a little contempt there for the things that we critique, namely, late stage capitalism, being one of the big drivers of my work, at least. But I think the other sensibility that I've really found criticism to be an attractive container for is something along the lines of argumentativeness, in that I think that sometimes when people speak to me, and I know I have many character defects, and this is one of them, I think they kind of find that I needle a little bit, or I'm often trying to get to the heart of the matter and saying things like, say more, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? And it is very annoying, and I'm trying to stop. And I think criticism is such a good place to act that out sometimes. Maybe that's just a kind of, perhaps a lighter way to put that is curiosity and healthy rage, a kind of angry curiosity.
I'd agree. I write from a place of contempt as well, and sometimes it oscillates. We were talking about it backstage, and I was saying it oscillates between contempt and care. And I'm just like, sometimes you want to see something I write cultural and literary criticism, and thinking about books or culture and thinking about those things sometimes brings about some contemptuous feelings, because especially when you think through it through capital and empire, and it drives me to write the criticism that I write, and just coming from that curiosity angle too, and just wanting to bring those two feelings together and try to find that that midpoint of that wide spectrum between contempt and care, and that definitely drives a lot of my writing.
And I think similar thoughts from me, but also not only trying to find the midpoint, but then also it's kind of like, if I'm feeling too contemptuous, it's kind of like, how do I bring the care back into my practice, lest I become like a wizened, disgruntled old man? But also I think it's difficult sometimes to not feel contempt towards some of the major literary discourses in this country, I would say. And I think especially, if we were in the last panel, we already heard this notion of perhaps like the great Australian novel, or like this major Australian literature. I think sometimes it is very difficult to view that with anything other than contempt, which is why criticism is necessary.
Yeah, I think, and the kind of the genre maybe of the great Australian novel and the literature that is adjacent to that, I think has been often highly praised, perhaps overpraised, although I don't doubt that it's enjoyable, but under-critiqued for its ideological content. Like, one of the best reviews that I read last year was a kind of takedown of Trent Dalton's work by Katrina Menzies Pike, in which she points to the kind of national myths and kind of class racialized undercurrents that sit underneath his work. And I think that I really appreciated that as an example of the kind of criticism that I would aspire to, because it is not only evaluating a work or a piece of literature on the basis of its aesthetic qualities, which are, again, undoubtedly important, but also its ideological, or I guess political content, even if sometimes maybe we believe that something like a novel may be quite apolitical. I just wanted to shout that particular essay out.
Yeah, I think criticism is inherently political. I don't see any point in aesthetical criticism, because then it's marketing. And I think criticism should always be antithetical to marketing, which is something that is so pervasive in our lives now, especially with social media and things like that. And it's something I call the recommendations industrial complex, and and to critique from a place of contempt and care is extremely necessary to counteract those elements that we see that's so pervasive now.
And I think that notion of marketing, as it's almost like beating a dead horse, right? Where it's like we keep talking about the fact that in Australia, like it's almost like the idea of marketing is almost inseparable from the idea of criticism for certain people and certain publications, because of the fact that our industry is so small and there are so few critics in the country, and just like overall compared to, I guess, the industries in the US or the UK, for example. And I think as a result, you get almost this very like gatekeepy view from the powers that be, where it's like, if you don't provide enough glowing, luscious praise onto something, then you don't get invited back, or you don't get access. And there is that notion of, oh, well, if you want to be a working critic, you need to have the access. Is that something that you guys ever think about or feel, or do you feel like you're just completely fearless to that, and it's not a consideration for you guys at all?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think coming from, you know, my point of entry into criticism, which is, you know, spitballing to vortex, I don't really think about who's going to read it or whatever. It's just from my point of view, which is, you know, my opinion. You can agree with it or you don't have to. It doesn't really matter, and it's just enjoyable for me to really fixate on certain whether issues or you know, a writer's body of work and really try and dive deep into it, whether I'm writing, you know, so-called a takedown or looking more closely at their, you know, their subconscious fixations.
Yeah, and I don't think any one of us has ever written a takedown, really.
I think that's a form of marketing itself.
Oh, absolutely. Like, kind of spurning inflammatory discourse about books is precisely what also sells them, because then you get to pick a side and situate yourself in relation to, I do. There are people who do write takedowns. You know, it's not all about access. Sometimes it's about being inflammatory. But those careers don't last super long, as I'm sure we know. But yeah, I think what you said really resonates. I think especially in the Australian ecosystem, which is so small and in which a lot of critics are also working writers. So there's this kind of... the added dimension is not just that you'll lose access to the writers, but that because you yourself are one of them, if you were overly castigating or contemptuous or whatever, you would then kind of cop it yourself. So I think that trying to kind of play both games simultaneously sometimes can stop us from spreading our wings a little bit. And yeah, I also think that issue of access, as you said, is starting to cause a real rot in various industries, like not just journalism, in which the price of access is just writing really limited kind of sponsorship kind of pieces of writing about whether it be a weapons factory or a hotel or a writer or whatever. It's like, well, I got to have this chat with this person, so I better talk about how great they are. Or, yeah, like if we were to take it to a more extreme kind of end, journalists who get embedded in conflict kind of scenarios, who have to kind of really promote, propaganda at a certain point, whether that be the ADF or the IDF. So I think it is genuinely concerning, and part of the issue there, I think, is maybe, and maybe you can speak to this a lot more, due to your role at The Guardian, is resourcing. Like, you know, journalism is being destroyed due to lack of resourcing, as we know. Like, there's a lack of, I think, investigative kind of journalism happening, which is perhaps less relevant to arts criticism. But also, I think people remember the days when you could sustain a weekly arts column, say, or a weekly music column, or a lit column, and that is kind of, well, I don't know, you tell me, is there room for that?
I think it's interesting, right? Because obviously, yeah, like as you said, we all dream of the halcyon days where Carrie Bradshaw is getting paid $4 a word.
Yeah.
And, you know, like, it's like those days are definitively over.
I couldn't help but wonder why.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think, yes, there is a resourcing problem across the entire industry, and I think it's specifically a money problem, and it's like people do not value, financially or otherwise, the importance of criticism and the importance of writing in general, but particularly writing about the arts, particularly not just writing about the arts, but genuine critiques of the arts, which are beyond just marketing fluff or things that can be used to sell a show. I think something that I do find myself losing sleep over is what what is the future for younger critics in this country? Because I think even though all of us have clawed our way to kind of finding some form of semi-sustainable career in writing and criticism, even the world that we entered into is not the same landscape and the same industry that people are entering into today. Like, so I guess what pathways does a 16-year-old, a 17-year-old who's just beginning to write criticism have in this country?
Yeah, I guess maybe a Ryan Gosling film review kind of. Yeah, I mean, maybe because I'm not 16 or 17, and nor would anyone even have come close to assuming that. I guess, yeah, maybe for me the question I'm getting out of that is, what is the value of criticism? Clearly we place a declining monetary value on it. And as resourcing dries up, we get kind of shepherded into really market-friendly forms of criticism, like writing, like recommendations in the kind of Substack newsletter, what I'm reading kind of thing, which is fantastic in its own way. But I think that we have less of it, and maybe this is a juncture where it is useful to ask what its value is. We were talking about this earlier, like we're kind of living through a time of collapse. What is the point of any of these fun little pretty words, especially something that's arguably navel-gazing or self-reflexive? You know, arts criticism only looks back onto itself. Well, I mean, obviously I disagree with that, because we can make important political critiques, I think, if we think that books and other pieces of art index the kind of broader health of a society, which I think is the case. So, yeah, I think that there's always, for me, the political importance of criticism, as well as the fact that I don't think that writing only matters as much as we let it. For me, ultimately, it is just a real source of pleasure, and the sustenance that it gives me allows me to keep going on and do all the other things that make up a life, including arguably political struggle. So, and then I'm curious to hear if this will resonate with you, Cher. I think criticism to me also has value. You've identified that there's that pleasure there where you're following like things that you're interested in and inquiring about. And I think that's actually really generous, right? Like as writers, most of us, the biggest compliment is to be closely read. Whether that is positively or negatively, most of us just want to be respected enough to have someone try to take the time to see and witness us, and kind of look at what it is that we're attempting to do, whether we succeed or not. To be understood in that way is like really fulfilling, and to give that to others, I think, can be fulfilling. And then you and I also, and you and I kind of work in commissioning literature reviews. Please correct me if I'm wrong. That's I'm sure you are commissioning work across arts and culture. Yeah, and presumably that includes lit. I think that's like a kind of active service as well. Okay, so those are my like 4 arguments for the value of criticism.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, going back to what Michael was saying about, what keeps him up at night about, younger people writing criticism. I think there's still many outlets. I mean, there's still many newsletters and Reddit threads and YouTube. It's just taken different forms now, I think. And maybe it's not a traditional path anymore, because there is no traditional path in these times. We can't all be Susan Sontag or, like now. So there are ways to be a critic, whether, known or unknown. I think there are ways to enter that. And I find the value of criticism still incredibly important, especially in these times of collapse, especially when Eda was talking about, propaganda that is surmounting now in journalism, criticism works to counteract that, and especially, you know, in this so-called post-truth age where we're thinking, you know, what's real, what's not real. I think criticism helps to try and disentangle those problems, and I think just it's something that we really need to see more of. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing that you mentioned, Eda, as well, was this notion of writing and criticism as something which gives you pleasure. And I think for me, it's also like, yes, we can defend criticism for hours and we can justify its political significance and its like tool for resistance, et cetera, et cetera. But I also think it's really important that some forms of criticism, I guess, are just for the pursuit of pleasure. And I think in that sense, it's kind of like people often try and make these arguments for, I guess, the necessity of art in society, either by like economic or political terms, but then sometimes it's like, it is just a pleasure. It can just be frippery, and it still very much deserves a place in society, even in times of collapse, I think. And I think that is also why I write criticism often, is just to understand a work and to understand sometimes myself and my own response to that. And I think it's a form of, like, it can be a form of play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about making sense of who you are in this time and place right now. And your critique of, you know, whether that's a play or book or, you know, something that you've noticed in the cultural world, it's indefinitely your positionality affects how you write it. And that's what makes criticism really exciting for me, because, you know, for example, we could all review the same book or the same, you know, play or something, and it'll all be different. And that's the fun thing. And I think when you were talking of pleasure, I mean, obviously there's pleasure. I mean, even in the contempt, there is pleasure.
Yeah, as Brian said in the previous session, like, we enjoy our symptom, and criticism clearly is a big example of that. And what you just said kind of reminds me of the question I wanted to ask both of you, which is precisely about the role that the personal plays in criticism, because I know that that's a trend, and you actually said this literally yesterday before your reading, where you were like, it's this thing that people do now where they do the memoir section about themselves before they move into a more traditional kind of review format. So a lot of review essays are quasi-personal essays, and it can be so important in terms of positionality to situate yourself and talk about how you relate to a text. But at the same time, I'm seeing, critiques of that coming through, where I guess the critique I've heard is that it centers the self, and you lose the act of service in a way that it is meant to come out in criticism. So I just kind of wanted to canvass both of your views about, if that personal is important.
I think the personal can come out implicitly in the critique. It doesn't have to be explicit, as in, you know, I did this thing, and then tangentially you go into the work that you're critiquing. I mean, sometimes I read stuff and I'm just like, no, this doesn't make any sense. Like, you're just trying to wax lyrical about some kind of experience.
You mean like my therapy anecdote?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, sometimes there is, I think when we talk about the positionality, it can be, there's too much emphasis on it sometimes, and people take that maybe too literally and then end up writing, you know, what would be more of a personal essay than a critique, which to me isn't really criticism, because then that's a creative nonfiction piece. I think yourself comes through in the criticism. You don't have to actually say, or this tangential experience that led to your book, because I feel sometimes the writing that I read or edit, there is this tendency to do that, and sometimes I see that the writer seems to be just doing that to try and fill up the word count or something like that, or to, I don't know, to try and like insert the personal in their critique, which isn't always what people want to read, because it can become quite self-indulgent.
I think the line between like a review essay and a personal essay can be quite porous, and I think I do view it as more porous perhaps than you do, Cher. As evidenced by Cher cutting out long tracks of my personal essay from a recent review that I wrote for her.
You can't get over that, obviously.
I think, like, look, it does work, I think, at times. I think there are two specific instances, I think, in which it really irks me. I think number one is when I can tell that the writer is inserting themselves into a piece almost defensively, where they're like, oh, like, I'm allowed to make this critique because I am who I am, as expressed over an 800-word introduction. It's almost this very, like, online brain way of writing where you're just like preemptively defending yourself against any claims that could be made of you being unfair or unjust or unrepresentative or whatever by laying out everything that you have in common with the author or the book. I think that really irks me. I think number two is kind of this idea of like critics as brand building. And I think sometimes that does come across in certain like personal review essays as well. And I guess my response to that, I'm like, there are so many better ways to be an influencer. Like, there's so many easier ways to be an influencer. It's like, why have you chosen criticism as your desired path?
Yeah. And that relates to, the marketing angle that we were talking about. Sometimes people write criticism to market themselves, for the virality or whatever they're seeking.
One thing that we were talking about last night as well, actually, was, I guess, on that note of the public intellectual kind of critic, is that why don't we really have that culture in Australia? Obviously, the clear answer is that the industry is too small, blah, 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 blah. People don't really read criticism here. But I do feel as if, like, in the US, you do have these very prominent critics, both historically and in present day. You have people like Merve Emre or Andrea Longchu, who are very widely read, very widely appreciated, and have become, in their own sense, I guess, quote unquote, famous for the criticism. I think that doesn't really exist in Australia, but maybe that's for the better. How do we feel about that?
Yeah, like my answer last night was maybe something along the lines of the training that obviously not all of the people that we would consider to be public intellectual critics have formal training, but someone like Merve Emre, kind of is very embedded in that Ivy system, and we don't have we kind of have analogous institutions, but they are not exactly the same. And then I think maybe part of the reason that we may not have as many prominent public intellectual critics is what you just identified, that the industry is a little smaller and everyone has to kind of be mates. And I think it's harder to take someone seriously if every review they write is glowing, or, there are some writers that I won't name who have blurbed provided endorsements for every single book under the sun. It's kind of like, well, you can't possibly have enjoyed and found every single one tender, urgent, and thoughtful, can you? And then I kind of wonder, although of course it is very kind and generous to be a wide reader and see the merits of books and want more books in the world, don't get me wrong. But I think maybe, we think of someone like Mary Vera and Andrea Long Chu, especially Andrea Long Chu, as having a real edge. And maybe that's that risk taking that is really hard to do sometimes. And then I wonder if another possible, this one's more speculative answer, is that we don't have as many prominent public intellectual critics because Australian books themselves, the kinds of texts that we would be reviewing and doing criticism of, themselves don't have as large international profiles. So my feeling is maybe that as Australian novelists like the Murnanes and the Harawers and the Garners, as they start to kind of proliferate outside of this country, people who write criticism about them themselves will also have their profiles lift, because of course that's like a symbiotic kind of system.
Yeah, I mean, the problem why there isn't someone like that is, money. That how many outlets are there to write criticism now? Like sometimes I think, when a young critic approaches me to ask me, I can only name a few outlets really. So and in those centres of cultural production in UK and US, there's just so many you can really pick and choose, and I suppose that's why we don't really have someone like that. And also, as Eda was saying, we all have to be mates. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think there's also this colonial hangover that Australia has of repressed, British wars, and that ends up being we see people less interested in taking risks as a result, because afraid to offend, afraid to make waves or something like that, and you have people talking about books behind closed doors that you may not see, private group chats, or even just, and you don't see those writing outside in the public sphere, and that's just not going to make criticism flourish in Australia.
Yeah, I think. Sorry.
No, go.
Yeah, I think that's precisely it. I think to me the biggest signal that a work has actually not been critically received very well is if there's a silence from the publications that will usually review books, because maybe it's if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all kind of thing, but also limited resourcing, right? You can't commission reviews on every single thing that has been published, so you tend to gravitate towards the ones that you respect, like the look of, think is a go for the kind of prize circuit, so those will tend to get reviewed. And then the mass market kind of commercial paperbacks, well, they get their own rewards, which is the sales and the money, so they're probably fine and happy actually. But I guess maybe one other thing I would try to say as delicately as possible is that sometimes, especially when people are online and have access to reviewers and a review offends, authors will attack reviewers. I've seen it happen. Someone threatened to sue me, actually, not because I wrote a review, but because I edited the review that was published. So, I mean, there's kind of a chilling effect. You kind of maybe think twice before you go near a certain book or a certain author again, and it truly does happen that there are private threats that come through from certain authors where it's just like, you better not say anything bad about my book. And part of that again is the money thing. They are trying to protect their careers. You almost can't blame them, except for the vicious tactics that they employ. But
I find the train of thought behind a bad review is going to sink your career. I mean, that's fallacious. I mean, I don't know why authors would even think that, even in a small pool such as Australian literature. And I find it quite sad, to be honest. You know, I was across Eda's experience. I won't say what the experience was, but shortly after, I commissioned something for Me Engine, and the author wrote a fairly generous but slightly critical review of a book. And the writer, the author of the book, emailed my editor-in-chief at the time to say, well, I disagree with this review.
Right.
The writer has to issue an apology. And yeah, both of us obviously disagreed, and we just, you know, told her it's obviously reviews are reviews, and it wasn't even a takedown or anything like that. So I think, yeah, these things do create chilling effects, and again, we come back to, you know, marketing, propaganda, and that's all very oppositional to what a lively critical culture would mean. And I'm hoping that it will change in the next few years.
It's crazy to me that we live in a culture, we live in a society, sorry, where someone thinks that because they disagree with a review of their work, that an apology from the writer is even something that they can fantasize about. It's like, at what point does that enter your mind? And I'm just curious, because obviously, like, both of you are now published authors and working critics. What was your response to the reviews and the kind of writing published about your books? How did you approach that?
I was hoping for more negative reviews, but I didn't really get any. I don't know. I think it's healthy to really judge, you know, art in a way that's not glowing. And I feel that because of things like publishing cycles, which, you know, a lot of Australian publications follow, it's become an endemic problem in that it has to be like a recommendation so people can go and buy it, due to the fact that, you know, books aren't really a sell here. And I suppose that, yeah, I would love to see a negative review, so, you know.
Yeah, I think there's like, I don't know if it's true or not, but people joke that like condom sizing has blown out, right? You have to start at large to go up to extra large to extra large, and it seems like, I'll get there in a second. Reviews start at a rave, and then they have to go to a mega rave, and then I'm gonna kill myself. I love this book so much, and so like anything short of that is maybe viewed as a smear sometimes. But sorry, to answer your question, to be honest, I didn't, because I know myself so well, and I didn't want to lose sleep, and I don't believe it's healthy at all to have to interface directly with everything anyone has ever thought about you, especially if you're a memoirist writing personal work. I didn't read my reviews. I made sure not to read them. My girlfriend would read them because she's very kind and obliging that way. In fact, she would check Goodreads like literally every single day and be like, "There's another one," and I would kind of put my head in my hands and try to avoid looking at her phone. But she would read them and filter to me some things that she thought might be useful to know, like the kind stuff as well as the substantive critiques. I suppose I just didn't want to know that people were saying like, "What a dumb C word," etc. So yeah, I think for me at least, this is where self-knowledge can be helpful. Having that filter in place was really useful, and I tried to bear critiques with grace. Like the critique of my book that I most had to force myself to tolerate was someone who called it ideological, like it was too like rah, 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 socialism, blah. which is, that fine. And I'm at peace with it, as much as I disagree with that take. I'm not asking for a formal retraction or an apology. I hope that just furthers the conversation about what we think books can and should do, and whether or not they need to be quote unquote apolitical, because obviously I think that all books are secretly, you either declare your ideology or you hide your ideology. So yeah, I think not reading them was the thing, and like, thank God I didn't. There was one that said that my father is illiterate because they'd misunderstood my book, and I suppose there's this feeling that old ethnic men can't read or write. But I think for me at least, I just really had to let it go and move on. Yeah.
It reminds me also, I saw you post about your book being in a bookstore listed under social justice.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't remember that.
Which is crazy. Like, the way we think about books in Australia is insane at all times.
I was looking at what categories my book was in, and it was just a very funny spectrum of what people thought it was under, and one of them was anti-racism. And I was like, oh, okay.
Wait,
great.
sorry, are you pro-racism?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I'll put that in my negative review. Well, is it okay if I ask?
Please.
Yeah. What do the two of you do when you truly do hate something? Like, is it let go and let God, I'm not going to touch it, or is it
Hate something as in
a book or a movie or a cultural artifact?
If I could let go and find God when I hated something, I wouldn't be a critic.
Yeah, I'm not going to let go of that. I mean, I may not write something for publication, but I would write something for myself, or go on Letterboxd, or or tweet something about it. If something consumes me with so much hatred, I would definitely not let go of it.
I guess I'm also asking, like, especially with your commissioning work, do you look at something and go, oh, that's vile, I better get someone to write about it?
Not necessarily. I mean, I tend to ask people that I commission if there's anything that interests them, or something that they feel that they really have to write about, whether from a place of hate or a place of care. And that often opens up a lot of very interesting possibilities, because we all read very differently. And I don't believe in a publishing cycle at all, which is why at Me Engine there is, I don't follow what's new or, what's popular. It's more about what I'm interested in, what the writer's interested in, and it's a collaboration between us to get this, critical work that is also a piece of art that responds to whatever they're writing about.
Yeah, I think I'm on the same page, where it's like I definitely have sometimes write from a place of contempt, but I think that I generally would try and avoid commissioning from a place of contempt, and letting the writer bring that in if they themselves do indeed feel that. I think one thing that I actually wanted to mention, because I was inspired by the classification of your book, Cher, as anti-racism, is that I feel like now in my career, I think I'm lucky to be in a stage where I can just kind of freely have my opinions on anything, and I know that my editors are there to back me up and support and keep giving me work, even if someone complains or et cetera, et cetera. But I think earlier in my career, I definitely think there was like a fear that maybe other minority writers feel as well, where it's almost like it was scary at first to give like negative critiques to other POC writers, for example, or to other POC artists, because number one, you kind of feel like, oh, like, am I taking them down and like taking away an opportunity from them? I guess like that's kind of what I thought like much earlier in my career. Or number two, it's kind of like, well, are they going to respond to it negatively because they think that we're meant to be in like comrades in arms, like we're all in this together to uplift each other, when actually, of course, the purpose of criticism is not to uplift, but and as both of you were saying earlier, like the most generous thing a critic can do is provide a truthful, close reading of the work.
totally. As well as like take their ethical responsibilities seriously, and it sounds like you both approach things with a real ethic of care in mind. I think that was one of the most important lessons I learned when I was at the Sydney Review of Books from the then editor Katrina Menzies-Pike, who often said that we have responsibilities as editors and people who are making criticism come out into the world to check with the people, especially when someone has written a negative review, to check with them and at least just inform them that backlash is possible, to maybe if it's an intra-community kind of thing, to suggest to them that they have a chat, or just warn that it's coming down the line, or yeah, just really prime them. And I've found that to be quite useful at various times, to say like, hey, heads up, like you're entering an ecosystem here where social media is a thing and people might not like what you've written. And so I think being aware of the kind of ethical responsibilities can be quite helpful, because otherwise you get situations like that, and it sounds like it went straight to Mianjin, that email, like Mianjin was being held responsible rather than the person who wrote the review. So I do think that the publication has to wear any kind of backlash as well. I mean, does that happen? Like, are people pissed off about... Have you pissed anyone off or caused anyone to be pissed off?
I'm sure I have, but I've been lucky not to hear about it due to the due protection of my editors, who I'm eternally grateful for. We are kind of approaching the end of this chat, and I think one thing that I'd really like to talk about is, you know, as all conversations about criticism always go, I think it's very easy to get into this place of like doom and gloom, sleepless nights, losing sleep over what is the future of criticism, like is there a path forward, et cetera, et cetera. But on the flip side of that, and what a nice note to end on, what is bringing you joy in criticism right now?
What is bringing me joy in criticism right now?
Sorry.
Robust criticism. I mean, that brings me joy when I see that, you know, a critic is writing something that they feel very passionate about, whether, you know, from a place of contempt or care or both. That brings me joy. It's exciting, especially when the critic's quite stylish too, because I think criticism often is a story. It's a story about how you relate to the work and how the work sits in relation to culture now. And I guess that brings me joy.
I'm trying to think of... I'm so sorry. I'm sitting in front of a room of very literary people who are no doubt readers, and I'm blanking on the name of the writer that Andre Longchu's... Was it Rachel Cusk that Andre Longchu wrote a takedown of? Yeah, okay. I find, and this is not to say that all takedowns are amazing, but I think a really kind of pointed, there is a real role for, again, pointing out perhaps embedded kind of narrative or ideologies in the case of that review of Cusk's work about gender. Really exciting, and it created a discourse and multiple responses, but I found them all really fruitful. Even people who disagreed with Longchu's analysis, it caused them to go back to the source and kind of really actually pore over it more closely, which again, I think is a real act of respect. What about you?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think I particularly have been enjoying reading like very precise and very well-reasoned takedowns of works that I've really loved, because... Like
the Barbie movie. Sorry, that's the first Ryan Gosling movie I can think of.
No, mostly because I'm masochistic and I just love being told that my tastes are horrible. I think that's one. I think two, this is going to be like the nerdiest comment ever. I think similarly to you, Cher, I think I do extract a lot of joy when a critic is also like an amazing prose stylist. sorry to use the word pro-stylist. I think Cher, someone who we both love, who I'm constantly talking about, is the critic Phoebe Chen, whose work, like, who's a film critic, whose work I honestly reread her old work when I'm in need of critical joy in an often godless landscape. So
Yeah.
I'd recommend you seek her out. I think that brings us to the end of our session. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and tuning in. And once again, a reminder that you can buy Eda and Cher's and the work of all of our other brilliant people in this festival at the bookshop right behind you. This event was presented by Liminal in partnership with the Willow Centre and supported by the Victorian Government through Creative Victoria. Thank you so much.
Thanks for being here.